Hello, and welcome to Ignite, Fighting Fascism in the Age of Its Rise. This is episode 6. No one is coming to save you. In light of recent events around the world and, of course, in the United States of America, I made the decision to move this podcast episode up because it is clear to me now, more than it ever has been, that the tone and tenor of political discussion in our country is escalating to a dangerous point. Before we get into the rest of this episode, I do want to make sure that I'm pointing out none of what I'm providing in this episode is legal advice. I am not a lawyer, and none of this is practical self-defense training. We are talking about the concept of defending yourself and that no one is coming to save you. But the most important lesson you should learn from this entire chapter is that this is on you. You are responsible for defending yourself. I understand that I'm providing a lot of information, but at the end of the day, you need to rely on you. You need to do your own research, your own education, your own informing, and your own self-defending. And as this episode is so aptly described, no one is coming to save you. That is why in this episode, I want to talk about a very important, I would argue, crucial part of fighting fascism. And that is surviving fascism. You cannot fight fascism from jail. And you cannot fight fascism if fascism defeats you. Or if radical far-right extremists enact violence on you, your family, or scare you into losing your First Amendment rights. Indeed, these are serious and perilous times. We live in a time when the fundamental assumption that our government functions in our best interest has been shattered. And it is clear to anyone with critical thinking skills that the people with access to everything are attempting to take what little the rest of us have left. Indeed, with the rise of Christian nationalist authoritarianism, the question of self-defense becomes not just a personal question, but a political question as well. This chapter and episode addresses a hard truth. In the age of fascism, your safety is your responsibility. The state that should protect you may well be the source of your greatest danger. Understanding this reality and preparing for it, both mentally and physically, is not paranoia. It is prudence. Now, before we move on to this episode, I think it is important to distinguish and be very clear about something. Someone can take a messaging like this and flip it on its heels and suggest that somehow protecting yourself or preparing to protect yourself is encouraging or inciting violence. And if you haven't figured it out by now, that's just not how we roll on Ignite. Indeed, the language, the tenor, and the tone of this time is so fraught and so perilous that one of the most important things you can do to defend yourself and your family is to be mindful of rhetoric and to be mindful not to engage in increasing and inflammatory rhetoric, because quite candidly, these are not the same times. It's not the same as it was 2 years ago or 5 years ago. This fresh hell is very dangerous. I am not, to be very clear, telling you to shut the fuck up. I am asking you, for your own safety, to simply be accountable for the words and language that you use, and to also understand and actively practice the art of safety when using your voice. That does not mean that you should be silenced or afraid to speak out against the government. It simply means recognizing the times that you are in. Owning the accountability for your words is not the same thing as telling you to be silent. But let us also be very honest about the system that we are part of. Police in the United States kill over 3 people per day. The number as of the time of this recording is 3.7 people per day. Police officers are 15 times more likely to commit acts of domestic violence than people not involved with law enforcement. The everyday violence of policing, the violence of poverty, the violence of denying healthcare, these are baseline conditions that we exist in. And when we speak of defending ourselves against fascism, we are not just introducing violence into a peaceful system. We are acknowledging our right to protect ourselves within a system already structured by that violence. And stepping out of the recording and the written part of the podcast, just to really articulate, poverty in the United States is an egregious form of violence. It is violent when someone has to walk around clenching the side of their jaw because their tooth is in horrible pain and they cannot afford to go to the dentist. It is violence when someone goes to their car knowing that it may not start and that they may be late to work or they could lose their job simply because they can't afford to fix their vehicle. It is violence to deny someone access to life-saving health care. And while, of course, part of our goal to fight fascism is to address those systemic issues, we have to be very realistic that it has become a much more myopic situation. With the rise of fascism in the United States of America, we have to deal both with the systemic threats to our safety and the very real, individual, daily, actual present threats to our safety, like police violence, or like your neighbor turning you into your job because of something you said on social media. Getting someone fired because of their opinion on the internet is a form of violence. And now, as of the time of this recording, September 15th, the far right in America is on a vast, coordinated campaign to craft the narrative of, and then enact accountability to people expressing their opinions. And it is having devastating consequences. To be clear, this is a form of thought control, that has never been perpetrated at this scale in the United States. And it is only magnifying and increasing its intensity. And the lack of any kind of guardrails from our government or from political leaders to slow this down or to stop it or discourage it is simply not happening. In fact, today, September 15th, Vice President J.D. Vance openly encouraged American citizens to contact the employers of people who were expressing political beliefs that he did not support, while simultaneously advocating for free speech. The system is clearly and drastically and visually broken, and you cannot go around pretending that this version of America is not dangerous in its very, very present state. There are many forms of safety and security and self-defense that you need to start exercising. But the first and most practical form of safety and self-defense is situational awareness. Unfortunately, most people simply do not keep their head on a swivel. And all that has to really mean is you have to start being more present and aware of your surroundings. You have to start listening to your gut. You have to start listening to that piece of your brain in the back that says something isn't right. Those things are there for a reason. Your brain is a powerful piece of equipment that is actually designed to keep you safe. But the complexities of society, interpersonal relationships, and yes, politics, the economy, all of these things, they sort of take up a higher function of your brain. And what happens far too often is people just ignore that and they don't listen to their gut. Your senses, like your eyes and your ears, are able to detect things that your higher order function might not necessarily pick up on. Your thalamus and then your amygdala might recognize something which causes you to have that feeling that says, whoa, something's not right. And to be very clear, a lot of the times something is actually fine and there's nothing wrong. But what I'm asking you, indeed, what I'm really begging you to start doing is for your safety and your protection, start to listen to your gut. There is a well-known phrase in the self-defense community, which is to have your head on a swivel. And really all that means is to be situationally aware. Are you observing things around you, patterns around you, people around you, the places and spaces around you? I feel like this is very obvious to say, but when I talk to people about it, it's just something that people aren't doing. And that is because life is complex. Days are complex. Our situations are complex. But if you're not yet convinced that you will be safer by being more situationally aware, I'm simply asking you to start considering that. There are ways for you to do things like scanning a room, scanning the environment, looking around and seeing, is everyone here Do they belong here? Do they look like they belong here? Does something look off? Does something feel off? And challenge yourself to ask those questions. We've seen many times over the course of the last 2 years when some event has happened and people ask the question, people saw something peculiar or odd and they simply didn't say anything, or they thought someone else would do something. No one is coming to save you. You have to save yourself. So let us talk then about actual practical steps of safety, because there are many forms of actual safety. The first I want to talk about is actual digital security. So let's talk about the full spectrum of self-defense. And I want to be very clear for legal purposes that I am not a self-defense expert. I'm simply speaking to and asking you to apply and consider your own learning while talking about what I do to keep myself, my family, and my voice safe. So the first one, again, is digital security. Your digital footprint is factually a vulnerability. If you are public and open about your politics, you will face harassment. You will face things like doxing attempts, and you will face things like surveillance. You will also face things like attempts to compromise and get into your information. Now, again, I'm not telling you that you shouldn't speak out or you shouldn't use your voice. I'm simply asking you to be aware of what happens when you do. However, there are things you can do to increase and enhance your digital security and secure your digital footprint. Things like two-factor authentication. Do you have 2FA set up on your devices? But most importantly, your email. Most of us have one or two primary emails that we use for essential services, things like banking, things like communication, maybe your cell phone, all those types of things. If you're not using two-factor authentication, you absolutely must start using two-factor authentication. And if you're asking yourself, what is two-factor authentication? First of all, thank you. That's okay. You should be asking if you don't know. Two-factor authentication is just setting up an additional layer of security on top of your password so that when you type your password and login information, you get a notification or text message. If you didn't know what I was talking about, it's likely you're not using two-factor authentication and you need to pause this podcast right now and set up two-factor authentication on your email. Please set up two-factor authentication on your primary email. If someone is able to get into your primary email, the ability that they will have to cause chaos in your life is almost infinite. But the other things you can do for your digital footprint, are you being mindful of and using things like encrypted communication tools? We're actually going to talk about this in Digital OPSEC in the future. Are you limiting the essential personal information you share about yourself online? I think a very good example of this that might seem obvious for people, but if you're going away on vacation, don't post that you're away on vacation to Facebook or to Instagram or to whatever social media platform you're using. And the reason for that is if you post that you're away from your home, people are going to assume that your home is vulnerable and easier to access. And so you shouldn't do that. But that also applies to things like posting pictures of where you work. Maybe you post a selfie of yourself while you're on your lunch break at work. Again, I'm not saying you can't do these things. I'm saying if you're concerned that someone might dox you and find your location, if you post a very visible picture of yourself in a location which is easy to identify, you're simply adding an additional layer of risk. And I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm simply saying if you want to protect yourself, you should be mindful of that. Now, limiting your personal information is also increasingly more important. I am a millennial, an older millennial. A good chunk of my social media is directly tied to personally identifiable information. My first and last name in a lot of instances. This is actually a terrible idea. You should not do this because it makes the road to connecting you, your family, your work just much, much easier. Listen, I can't go backwards in time and re-educate myself, but I hope to be able to share with you what I've learned so that you can learn with me. Try not to use PII, personal identifiable information about yourself in your social media and handles and profiles. I'm learning to do this better myself as well. If you are a public figure, this is very hard to do, but you can find ways to insulate yourself. If you have ways to separate your personal activism from your private self, I would encourage you to add those layers in. One thing I do try to do is I do try to have separate social media for my specific activism pages and content creation from my individual hyper personal social media pages. And to be very, very honest with you, I simply don't post personal information on my personal social media pages anymore. In fact, when it comes to digital communications, as my wife would most certainly tell you, I I really actively avoid communicating as much as possible. Even on things like text message or signal or messaging chats, I simply avoid creating a digital footprint when and where I can. Now, not everyone can do that, but the less sort of exhaust digitally that you create, the safer that you're going to be. And it's really sad that we are in this situation, but we are in the situation nonetheless. So I couldn't possibly cover all of those things. So let me give you a little bit of research that you can do on your own. Look up digital exhaust. The term digital exhaust is what kind of footprint are you leaving in the wake of your digital communications? Look up two factor authentication. Actually go into your social media accounts, profiles, your emails, your banking platforms. Go into the security sections of those platforms and ensure that you have maximized all of those things. Just make sure that you're doing it. I'm not telling you to be quiet, but I'm also just asking you if you're going to use your voice, if you're going to post photos of yourself, you're going to put those things out there, simply be, as we first started talking about, situationally aware of what your output is. If you don't want someone to know where you work, I would recommend not posting a picture that is identifiable of where you work. If you don't care, you just simply have to embrace the accountability of knowing that the world is full of dangerous people and that they may try to take advantage of that information. There's an additional layer of self-defense that, of course, we'll have to talk about then. One of the lessons I think people learn the hard way when it comes to physical safety in this era is physical safety at protests. If you participate in protests, understand that the police will likely use things like chemical weapons or batons or other forms of violence. I would like to say that community policing has increased since the summer of 2020 and that police are better training and equipping themselves to be de escalation experts, but there is simply nothing to suggest that this is even remotely true. And my personal experience lately has been that police violence has not only escalated, but is being openly celebrated in the United States of America. So, some things you can do in that hyper specific situation is understand how to respond to things like tear gas and pepper spray exposure, wearing protective clothing that covers your skin, staying in groups and not isolating yourself where you could be more easily exposed to violence, having and planning exit strategies before arriving at any direct action, carrying your emergency contact information either visibly or preferably written on yourself in permanent marker, and committing in advance to nonviolence at protests is really essential. We could cover this specific topic in like 2 hours of podcasting specifically, but do some research on those things. Don't count on the police to de escalate at protests. Educate and inform yourself. No one is coming to save you. Let's talk about another form of defense, which is community defense. At Rebel Radio, we speak often about breaking down the barriers of what mutual aid actually is. Individual self defense, while necessary, is insufficient for long term survival of fascism. If you are going to effectively push back against an increasingly powerful government, you have to build and create the systems in your local community to provide mutual aid. But we have overcomplicated what mutual aid actually looks like. Taking out your neighbor's trash when they're on vacation is a form of mutual aid. Looking after their children so that they can go to the store is a form of mutual aid. Helping out at a food bank or giving food bank supplies or food is a form of mutual aid. There are thousands of things that are actually mutual aid that we don't even consider mutual aid because we have overcomplicated the topic. But the first and most important step is to develop and identify those mutual aid structures in your community create communication systems that function, for example, when normal infrastructure fails. And this is something that we're actively working on in the Rebel Radio community, building trust and accountability within that mutual aid group, and training each other and together in various forms. One of the best ways that you can do this, that we talk about this a lot on Rebel Radio, is what skill do you uniquely have that you can train your local community in? How can you educate and upskill your community? That's a powerful way to fight fascism. It's a powerful way to defend yourself. What do I mean when I say that? Well, maybe you're really good at cooking and someone in your mutual aid network simply just isn't. The first part of that is to create a space where that's okay to acknowledge that and seek and educate and inform. Or maybe you're great with sewing and you can teach people how to repair their own clothes or how to make masks or how to save money by thrifting and tailoring your clothes individually. That is a form of mutual aid. So people don't think about mutual aid as a self defense, but it's actually the most effective self defense against fascism. We're going to break down mutual aid more specifically in an entire episode of Ignite. But the lesson there for you, if you're not familiar with mutual aid, is to better acquaint yourself and break down the barriers and myths of what it actually is. Now let's talk about perhaps the most complex topic of self-defense. And it's one that we have to both acknowledge and talk about in a space where it's not often discussed. And it's really the question of armed self-defense. In discussing self-defense in the age of fascism, we cannot avoid the question of firearms. It's perhaps the most complex and emotionally charged aspect of personal protection, particularly for those of us on the left who have traditionally advocated for gun control. Research, however, shows that people who perpetrate mass violence often have histories of domestic violence and that what am I trying to say? Something the left has to recognize and really come to terms with is that the reality is that the same government we would normally look to for gun control is increasingly the source of the threat that we face. What I mean specifically is police officers are not required to protect you. The Supreme Court has actually ruled on this explicitly. When seconds count, the people who may arrive may be aligned with those who wish to harm you. You are your own first responder. No one is coming to save you. There is a very tragic example of self-defense, policing, and how bad it can all go. On November 12th, 2024, Brandon Durham, a 43-year-old homeowner, called to report a home invasion at his residence in Las Vegas. Durham had told dispatchers that suspects were attempting to enter the front and back of his residence. During his 11-minute call, Durham provided Las Vegas Metropolitan Police with a thorough description of what the intruder was wearing: a red ski mask. Durham was in his underwear since he was in bed prior to the break-in. When officers arrived, he found Durham struggling with an intruder, and the intruder had a knife. They were both struggling with it. There was unfortunately a body camera incident of all of this. The officer ordered two people, the two who were struggling over the knife, to drop the weapon. The officer then shot Brandon Durham 6 times. Brandon Durham died from gunshot wounds. That's how bad and how quickly things can go. To underscore the tragedy of this situation, what is most, I think, horrifying is the same police officer that shot Brandon Durham had been at his house less than 24 hours before the shooting. Durham had let Officer Bookman into his home by using his thumbprint on his front door when he had called the police to remove someone from his home. And Officer Bookman knew he was dealing with the same person because he said so on his body camera. Listen, I make no bones about my historic interactions with police, and I understand that people have different opinions. My opinions of the police don't matter in this conversation. What I'm trying to articulate to you is you should not depend on the police as a form and method of your own self-defense. Tragically, the Durham family has to live with these consequences. And Las Vegas Metro Police and many other policing agencies across the country utilize things like qualified immunity so that officers don't actually ever face any kind of accountability. And in this situation, this officer was not indicted. When crucial seconds matter, you have to be the person who decides how to defend yourself. You can't wait for the police. If you're considering this topic, firearms ownership, you have to be a responsible firearm owner. And if you are considering ownership of a firearm for your own protection, you need to approach it with the gravity that it deserves. And the first part there is training. Owning a gun without proper training makes you and everyone around you less safe. I'm a strong advocate of concealed carry specifically for this purpose. In Nevada and in other states, to acquire a concealed carry, many times you have to go through an extensive training. You will have to learn things like firearms proficiency, de-escalation, when to use and when not to use a weapon. You will better understand your local laws regarding self-defense. You will better understand things like mental health preparation. Using a firearm is a very traumatic experience, and a lot of people simply don't prepare for or understand that. But also what I would tell you a lot of people don't understand is if you incorrectly use a firearm in self-defense, your life could be ruined. You could be financially devastated by lawsuits. You could face criminal prosecution for your attempt to what you thought was defend yourself. Many times in America, people brandish their weapons in what they claim is self-defense, but is actually antagonizing someone else. And those people often face serious criminal charges for doing that. That would not necessarily have happened if they had not been armed in that situation and if they had better trained themselves on de-escalation and the appropriate use of force. They simply could have avoided wrecking their lives. The other part of owning a firearm is safely storing that. Firearms in homes increases the risk of domestic violence as well as suicide. So if you choose to own a firearm, you need to invest in a proper safe that gives you quick access. You need to consider where and how you store your ammunition. And you need to ensure that your entire household understands safe handling procedures. And of course, because this is such a fraught issue, I have to take a little bit of a second out here to say I am not a legal expert. I am definitely not a firearms expert. I am definitely not a self defense expert. But I have, through the course of time, both seen and come to understand the hazards of this type of self protection. But there are also benefits to being protected if you own a firearm. One of the ways that you can better equip yourself is to lean into that community. If you choose to own a firearm, there are actually groups that do things like safe training, range training, get togethers, community activities. The more you learn to safely use your firearm, the better equipped you will be in the very unfortunate incident that you might have to use it. And of course, all of this is predicated on legally owning that firearm. Are you legally able to? Have you followed all the necessary steps in order to do that? If you choose to, for example, carry a firearm concealed, does your state require you to have a permit? Have you gone through that permitting process? Have you done everything legal and the correct way? Your rights are only as good as your willingness to safely and intelligently exercise them. And one of the most dangerous things that you can do, should you choose to own a firearm, is to own and use it irresponsibly. So I mention this and I bring this up with a heavy sense of understanding that this is not an easy topic. It is not a topic which is easy to discuss. And it is not a topic that people are comfortable both talking about, but then actually practically engaging in. If you're going to choose to exercise self-defense and you're going to choose to own a firearm, you must do so responsibly. So to recap, are you properly training yourself on how you're using that weapon, how to store it, how to load it, when and where, and how to clean that weapon, for example? How much do you know about proper handling? If you don't know these things, there's a ton of information available. I am not the right person for that. But what I'm trying to tell you and what I'm trying to inform you here is you have you have to be a responsible firearms owner. Now, the next part of this conversation is also equally important. And that is, if you're fundamentally uncomfortable with firearm ownership, that is okay. You should never feel pressured to purchase or to use a firearm in your own self-defense. If it's something you're, you know, fundamentally opposed to, that is going to make that a less effective form of defense, and that is okay for you to practice your own value system. Some other things you can do if firearm ownership is not for you is physical preparation, basic first aid training. Do you know how to treat wounds, recognize shock? Do you know how to stabilize someone until professional help arrives? Many community organizing and mutual aid efforts offer things like free first aid training. You can watch things like YouTube videos. And again, not a medical expert, but if you equip yourself on things like how to triage a wound, you will be more prepared and you won't regret having that knowledge. What about physical fitness? Your ability to run, climb, or otherwise move quickly could actually save your life. And if other forms of self defense are not for you, perhaps you could consider basic self defense training. Learning how to break free from grabs or create distance from an attacker. These types of things can actually and tactically and practically save your life. If you can't afford to attend a personal safety training or to learn something like martial arts as a form of self defense, you can at least increase your knowledge by looking at these things on, for example, YouTube. There's a ton of information. When it comes to your home, are you reinforcing security of things like entry points? Do you have unnecessarily vulnerable areas and ways to access your home? Have you properly reinforced entry points? Can you install things like motion lighting or have a camera system or have emergency communication plans? There's also mental preparedness, thinking through how you might handle various threats you might face and how you would respond. Actually practicing that in your head. Do you have a support network and do you know how to activate it when necessary? If you're receiving practical threats to your safety, document those threats to your safety. And the last part is actually quite essential. If you are going to be active in the work of fighting fascism, you need to be aware of and preferably have a lawyer or be aware of how to contact one in the event that you need one. When it comes to practical self-defense, of course, on Rebel Radio, we're going to talk about community building. Do you know your actual neighbors? We talked about skill sharing. We talked about resource pooling, communication systems. But the last part of this is understanding the limits of individual solutions. Obviously, your personal preparedness is essential, but we have to remember that individual self-defense is ultimately is really insufficient to address systemic threats, the things we talked about at the beginning. The goal here is not to become a fortress, but to build connection and community in order to do all of this work. So there is an intersection here that I want to talk about. Your personal safety and your political effectiveness are actually connected. Activists who are constantly worried about their physical safety cannot organize effectively. Taking responsible precaution is going to set you up to better prepare yourself. It's going to make you more confident. It's going to make you better resistor. Here's just a few things that I would encourage you to do. Setting your own personal boundaries about how public you are with your activism. If you are receiving threats, or just as a matter of practicality, are you varying your routines? I routinely vary my actual routine. When I drive from point A to point B as a routine practice, I routinely change that. Having secure communication with other organizers or with your family. How is your mental health? Are you familiar with, how is your financial safety right now? Those are all important conversations. But the most effective self-defense in the age of fascism is building the kind of community that fascists cannot destroy. These are things where people's personal needs are met, where their skills and resources are distributed, where trust has been built. And these communities are not just safer for the members, but it's actively hostile to the fascists. Because fascism thrives on isolation, on desperation, on scarcity. When you build community, you're building buttresses, fortresses against that. That collective care makes the fascist weaker. And the final thing I want to talk about is mindset. Vigilance, self-defense, requires a balance between optimism and hope and being vigilant and self-aware. You have to take the threat of our current moment seriously while not allowing that fear to consume you or to take away your joy or to take away your willingness to take direct action. You're not preparing for a movie here. You're preparing to be part of a resistance community, a community that lasts for years. You're preparing to be reliable for your neighbors. You're preparing to be someone that people can count on. The goal here is not to become hard and closed off from the world, but to become an effective member of your community who is not scared to go out into the world. And in the end, the best self-defense against fascism is not individual preparation, but it's building the movement we're trying to build. 1,000 leaders in 1,000 communities. One that is responsive to people's actual needs. One that is committed to collective liberation. Your safety matters. Your life matters. And your participation in building that better world matters most to me, most of all. So here's some action items, some challenges, some cheat codes. Number 1, assess your current digital security practices and implement at least 3 improvements this week. Number 2, tough one, connect with at least 2 neighbors you don't already know well. Number 3, learn basic first aid skills through a local Red Cross or community college course. Or there's many others. And maybe if you're familiar and comfortable, maybe you could host one for your neighbors. Number 4, identify 3 people you could call in different types of emergencies. If you're considering firearm ownership, just start to do research. Research before you purchase. Research and understand what you're getting into. And the last one is recognize that you are a valuable, productive, and really wonderful person. You deserve to be protected. You deserve to thrive and to achieve great things, even in these dark times. You deserve to be here tomorrow. I need you here for the next battle. I need you here for the next event. I need you here for the next episode. So the final thought is not selfish to think about defending yourself. Thank you for tuning in to Ignite, Fighting Fascism in the Age of Its Rise. Because of the intense nature of the conversation and because of the intense nature of America, honestly, this session was not recorded live and there is not an extended session. So to make up for that, I made it extra long and I hope that was helpful. Please do turn in for the next episode of Ignite, Fighting Fascism in the Age of Its Rise.